I love counterfactuals, but at the end of the day, I know that there's only one history. The only history that happened is the one in which we exist. And so anything I tweak, anything can happen.
I'm Michael Tamblyn, CEO of Rakuten Kobo. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest today is Phenderson Djèlí Clark. He's a writer of fantasy and speculative fiction. He has won or been nominated for just about every award for speculative fiction and fantasy you can fit on the shelf. The Hugo, the Nebula, Sturgeon, the World Fantasy Award. His new novel, A Master of Djinn, expands a universe in which supernatural beings of Middle Eastern and Egyptian mythology live alongside humans in 1910s Cairo. And just last year, he published a novella called Ring Shoutout, where the White Hoods of the Ku Klux Klan conceal actual demons from another dimension. His characters, whether they're solving cases in steampunk Cairo or chasing hellspawn across Georgia, feel as real as any historical figure, and maybe that has something to do with his day job as an academic historian. We're going to get into all of that and more in this interview. Phenderson Djèlí Clark, welcome to Kobo.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for having me. That was a fascinating intro. I should hire you to do that more often.
Hype man. That's
Yeah, that was great.
that's what I'm shooting for as a next career. Well, listen, pointy-headed, flesh-eating demons hiding under pointy white hoods is maybe the best premise for a supernatural horror story that I've ever come across. So we're going to get into that in a second. You have two big groupings of work right now, and I want to talk about both of them. The first are some very different stories that draw on the African diaspora. One, Ring Shoutout, set in the American South. The other, The Black God's Drums, an alternate history version of New Orleans. Let's talk about Ring Shoutout first, because that's how we get to pointy-headed, flesh-eating demons the fastest.
Right.
Tell me about Maurice Boudreau and the Ku Klux Klan she's fighting.
Yeah, in Ring Shout, just the story that kind of popped into my head and sat with me for a few years before I could figure out what I wanted to do with it. Maurice is a bootlegger along with her friends. If you're going to write something in the 1920s, you've got to have some bootlegging going on, right? That's what's happening in the background. She's a bootlegger in rural Georgia and Macon, Georgia. And she's also fighting the Klan, who, as you point out, are also extra-dimensional monsters. When I envisioned this story, it was always, people have called it a horror story, people have called it gothic, and I've also latched onto some of those names. But at the end of the day, I was writing a fantasy story, right? I have a heroine, she has a sword, and she fights monsters. It just so happened that I wanted to tell a fantasy story in a place most people wouldn't expect to tell a fantasy story. And I said, why not? They don't all have to be, some pre-industrial medieval setting. They can take place in time periods you wouldn't expect, and in backgrounds you wouldn't expect. And the Southern folklore and Southern mythology and everything else gave me everything I needed. And I was really happy that people went along with that ride, because I wasn't sure they would.
It is a great ride to go on. Did bringing the fantasy and the horror into the story let you explore some ideas about that time period in a different way?
One of the things is, as I always relate, the idea for these pointy-headed, fleshy, extra-dimensional beings actually come from ex-slaves who, during interviews that were taken in the 1930s and late 1920s, not too far from the time period I'm in, they describe the first Ku Klux Klan, which arises after the Civil War, as haints or as spirits or monsters or demons in some cases. And they point out that this first Klan didn't dress the way we think the Klan dresses. Some of them wore pointed horns on their heads. Others blackened their faces or did various different things or pretended they had tails. And so the idea of the Klan as monsters, I owe to them. And so what I did was I just projected that onto the second Klan and the coming of Birth of a Nation. It just seemed like that works perfectly, right? To use that folklore to explore this time period. And so in some ways, I'm using this mythology and this folklore that arose from these former slaves basically these free people talking about the horror that they lived through after the Civil War and the way they used fantasy and folklore to relate their trauma. And I wanted to talk about this second period of the Klan, which I think people know less about. Um, Even though the Klan was this powerful force, I was able to explore that during this time period, as well as, again, the movie Birth of a Nation.
Talk about Birth of a Nation for a second, because it almost
Mhm.
is, it's either its own character or it's an organizing principle in the story. Like it kind
Right,
of
yeah.
begins it and ends it.
Yeah, Birth of a Nation comes out in 1915. Of course, it's probably known as it's known as two things. It's known as one of the first bits of modern cinema, which a lot of present day cinema kind of grows out of. The camera angles that were used, the score that was used, it basically revolutionizes how cinema is going to be done. So it's considered, they're at the very dawn of cinema, and at the same time, it's also one of the most infamous movies ever made because the heroes in this movie are the Ku Klux Klan, and the villains are basically everyone else. And it's this lost cause revisionist version of history, this false narrative that, in many ways, we're still contending with today, right? When we speak of Confederate monuments and these things, so it has this power to continue on in other films like Gone with the Wind or what have you. This narrative that it was part of lingers on in many ways, and yet it has this important place with the beginning of our understanding of how we look at modern media and film. And when it came out, it was quite a phenomenon. People had never seen anything like it. White moviegoers watching the film would swoon in their seats. They would faint at certain scenes. There's a newspaper report that I always like pointing to in Florida of a man who pulls out a gun and starts shooting at the screen to stop a figure who is a white man in blackface, supposedly chasing a young white woman. And he pulls out his gun to shoot at this figure because to him, this is so real. And I teach classes on media and media theory. And so it, Birth of a Nation is always a great place to start this discussion, not only on how media gives us representation, but the very power of media, the medium of film itself, and what kind of power this may have over us. And students love debating, right? How much does the film impact them? How much are they bringing to the film that will help them interpret it, and so on. And so there was always a lot to discuss and unpack with Birth of a Nation. And so making it, as you say, a character or a central point in this book or movie magic, dare I say, it just seemed fitting.
One of the themes in Ring Shout is about anger, how it's
Mhm.
used, how it's focused. What do we learn about the uses and the dangers of anger across the course of this story?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things that when I was creating this story, I wanted to be certain that I didn't give the impression that I was saying that the Ku Klux Klan were simply monsters, right? That they were
Hmm.
pointy-headed monsters, and that's where their hate came from. So I made certain I wanted to say, like, no, they're human beings who choose to do this. The hate turns them into this, but the hate is something they bring, right? It's what they give to this. And so I wanted to make sure I didn't lessen them to monsters, because if they're just monsters, well, then it doesn't help us deal with the human experience and the fact that human beings can hold these ill thoughts of each other and carry out horrendous acts based upon it. And so, when as I'm telling the story, I also wanted to have the main character deal with those issues, deal with having justifiable anger that most people would say, I understand that anger. I understand why you're angry. And how do you channel that anger towards fighting injustice? And at what point might the anger, however, also consume you if you're not careful, right? And so I wanted to play along with that, but I also didn't want to give it like a kumbaya at the end. Well, love conquers all. I didn't want to give it. I wanted to make it realistic, right? Where this person has this anger, and it's something that gives them strength, even if at the same time it's something that they have to be concerned with. because I thought that's just a very human understanding.
Maris is such a compelling character, and she's also surrounded by this incredible team of women, refugees and
Yeah.
smart mouth friends, World War I veterans. But as you were talking about that, I was wondering whether, does each of those characters also kind of represent a different way to handle or process that anger? Because you have people who are, into conspiracy theories, or are more cynical, or into impetuous action, or just kind
Yeah.
of, exhausted and weary about the whole thing. Were they kind of a microcosm of the different ways that you can confront an insurmountable challenge?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think in many ways it's funny I haven't thought of it like that, but I think in some ways I saw myself doing that, right? You're faced with this injustice, you're faced with this senseless hatred. How do you react to it? And people are going to have different reactions, and certainly if I look at the history during that time period, people had different reactions, right? There were different groups that popped up, and so you're right. Among the various figures that orbit Maurice, there are the people who involve themselves in conspiracy theories. There are radical socialists. There are the others who say no, capitalism is what's going to destroy this, right? Some form of democratic capitalism, and and you have everything in between. You have appeals to Marcus Garvey and other things, right? And so there are all of these different forces, and all of them are trying to figure out, how am I going to deal with this senseless hate, this, as you said, this insurmountable challenge. And they're all trying to do it their own way in many ways. Yeah.
So the other story that deals with slavery and with an alternate history of rebellion and emancipation is the Black God's Drums.
Yeah.
And here we're living in an alternate history. There are airships. The U.S. Civil War is going in a very different direction than the one that we know. Tell me a bit about Creeper and the world that she lives in.
Yeah, this story existed before Ring Shot was even a glimmer,
Mhm.
right? I thought up this story, and I actually wanted to tell this story of the Black Atlantic, right? Of all these various communities, which some people also call, as you point out, the African diaspora. And I want to talk about these various Black Atlantic communities and how they intersect. And so when I first thought about this world, I actually wanted to set it based on a character who's a secondary character in the Black God's Drums, Anne Marie, the ship captain. And it was going to be her story. And it was going to involve her on her ship, kind of traversing back and forth to different ports and what have you, almost like a Black Atlantic Sinbad in some ways, right? And having various adventures.
And she's a very cool character. She's like
Yeah.
swashbuckling. It's her ship. She's,
Yeah, and she was the center. And then I came back and you take a second stab at it, and I said, what if I, instead of traversing all these places in the skies, what if I set it in one place? And what if that place was New Orleans, having grown up in Houston and New Orleans being next door and having visited so many times. And when I said it there, Creeper as a character just emerged as this voice that could speak for New Orleans, that people could see New Orleans through her eyes, right? And I said, I can't do it through Anne Marie's because she would be a visitor. I need somebody who knows New Orleans, who walks the streets, knows what it smells like, knows what it looks like, isn't fascinated by things because this is every day to her. And so she just came about almost naturally. I remember I started writing, and she was one of my favorite characters to write. This young character who is in many ways homeless, who is living by her own wits and her own ability to survive, and actually takes the initiative to try to find a way out of her predicament because she still has these fantastic dreams. Right. And so that was laying down the base of the character. And oh yes, she has a goddess that lives in her head. Right. That was an extra bonus. I was like, why not? Why not?
And what's the point of departure for that history? Where did things branch from what we know?
Yeah, this world pretty much looks like ours until certain events in the Haitian Revolution. And the revolution itself goes much as we think of it going. And there's a certain point when Napoleon Bonaparte sends his troops over to basically eventually re-enslave the colony, what happens here is a bit of steampunk weather machinery changes the course of things, and it alters the course of the world in many ways. And part of this was my wanting to make the Haitian Revolution, basically show how important the Haitian Revolution was in our own history by, magnifying and exaggerating it even more. And so, yeah, it's Haiti sits at the heart of this.
Your other group of stories is the Dead Djinn Universe, where your latest book, A Master of Djinn, is set. And here we have a world where, in the mid-1800s, a Sudanese mystic and inventor, Al-Jahiz, breaks the barrier that separates the world of humans from the world of the Djinn. And as they enter our world, they're not just bringing magic, but also technology. So we enter a 1910 Cairo that is an independent country, that is a technological powerhouse filled with airships and aerial tram cars and electricity, as well as different supernatural beings all mixed in together. Our first two introductions to this alternate history are two novellas that I loved, A Dead Djinn in Cairo and The Haunting of Tramcar 015. What was the spark that got you working on that story? Because Cairo's a long way from Haiti in the American South.
I think I was doing a lot of adjuncting at the time. I was working on my PhD, and I was teaching a lot of World Civ. And so I ended up talking a lot about anti-colonialism. And there are ways that, the Haitian Revolution, the Trinidadian writer and celebrated activist C.L.R. James wrote his book, Black Jacobins, in the 1930s. And he writes this book about the Haitian Revolution that happened, by then would have happened, 120 something years past. And he basically says, if you want to understand what the coming anti-colonial struggles are going to be like, look at the Haitian Revolution, right? And so there are ways I think I can tie some of those together. But in some ways, I was thinking of anti-colonialism. I was looking at the colonial world and thinking of how would one have stopped this, right? Or when colonialism ends and the quote unquote post-colonial happens, what is that like? How do these new nations attempt to forge and create their own identities after coming out of this colonial mindset? And it was somewhere I always tell people, somewhere between thinking about that and showing my students Pontecorvo's The Battle of Algiers one too many times, that the idea of this world came into being. And basically I was like, well, what can stop the Maxim gun, right? What can stop the power of industrialization? And I was like, oh, magic, right? I guess that'll be the cure for it. And that's how, in some ways, this world arose. Me wanting to tell this anti-colonial story that was at once supernatural, and also a bit humorous and fun, right? And I was like, how can I put all that possibly together and get away with it? And I think A Dead Djinn in Cairo, which was the first story, allowed me to do so.
And they're interesting because they cross a number of different genres. There's certainly that fantasy and speculative fiction piece to it. They're also crime novels. They're police procedurals at the same time. So as you were starting to layer like genres on top of each other, was it just because it felt like the story fit? Like that was the best way to show this place in this world that you created?
Yeah, in many ways, you're right. It was, and I always tell people this. I said it's really weird because I don't know that I sit down and I think too hard about genre when I'm writing. I'm like, oh no, I'm getting out of my lane. I'm crossing boundaries. Don't cross the streams, Ray. No, I'm not actually thinking about that as much. I'm trying to tell the story, and to me, it just seemed like normal that if I was going to have a Djinn here, that they were going to be great builders, because this is something that comes out of various, in manuscripts about Djinn and what have you, is that they're great builders. Well, it's the 1900s. What are they going to build? they're going to build something modern, of course. And
we need a transportation system. That's what we
yeah,
need.
it seemed like, yeah, any transportation system, there's going to be bureaucracy. It just seemed like, they were going to be these beings because they're magical. Like, we can adapt to anything, right? So we're not going to build you things that would have been built back in the past. We're going to build these more modern things. And then even in some of the writings and the mythology in works like, like from the Thousand and One Nights, there were tales of like automatons and different things. So there were a lot of things for me to pull from and never feel like, oh, I'm kind of veering left. It's all seemed very natural because one of the other things I was doing, the other book I'd read, of course, was Edward Said's Orientalism in grad school. And so another thing I was doing was really trying to subvert this notion of the Oriental East, right? As backwards, as primitivism and what have you, as opposed to, the forward-thinking Occidentals. I just wanted to subvert that completely and have this world that mashed it all together, that, that would not always make sense to Western eyes, but made sense to itself.
So this is also an advertisement for, never turn down that adjunct professor job where you have to teach.
It gets you to grad school, right? Yeah, and you never know what ideas it's going to whip up in your head as you're going along.
You gained momentum for this world through two novellas, and novellas are kind of a funny form.
Yeah.
Is it a way for you to kind of try a place on or try an idea on for size? Or what does that form give you?
Yeah, the form gives me the fact that I'm an overwriter. And when I try to write a short story...
So short story plus.
I end up with a Dead Djinn in Cairo. And I end up with no place to publish it. And thankfully, Tor comes along and says, hey, we'd like to do Novellas and Novellas. And I'm like, thank you. In fact, that's how Dead Djinn in Cairo came about. I wrote the story. I expected it to simply go nowhere because I was like, it's longer than anything can be published. And I simply put out a call on Facebook, of all places, just randomly, any place I could publish this. And at the time, Diana Foe was an editor at Tor. She was running her own steampunk site. I had built it as steampunk. And she was like, hey, send it to me. And I did. And well, here we are. So it was almost like she was my editor godmother, fairy godmother, just sitting in the wings, who happened to pick it up. I mean, how much luck and chance is that? But that's how that came about. And writing when I wrote A Dead Djinn in Cairo, I did not have any plans to do anything else. That's the secret. I didn't have plans to go on and create another novella or write a book. But because I think I like world building, I always left doors open. So I always knew I could go somewhere else. I left enough doors open that I didn't shut everything. So that's just how I tend to. I think it comes from my father. Whenever we would see a movie, and if they had an ending that like they had that little extra scene at the end, we would watch movies back in the day. He'd be like, "There's going to be a second one." I'd be like, "There's not going to be a second one, Dad. They just put that in there." He's like, "No, there's going to be a second one." It didn't matter what the movie was. He was certain. And so I think I tend to do that with my world building. And so when I got the very unexpected and humbling, like, we like this world, we like this story, give us more, I had a reason to think of more. And that's when The Haunting of Tramcar 015 came about. And then when that did well, which I was surprised, like, it's a silly story. It's about candy. So when that did well, I said, okay, I think I can do a novel here. And here we are.
Well, and just to kind of talk the industry side for a second, novellas and standalone short stories used to be the hardest of the hard sells for publishers, but it feels like ebooks have made it easier to try different sizes and lengths of stories on for size compared to the, like, it's 248 pages or get out of here.
Right.
So it was interesting to watch the interest build in the first two novellas and know that you could have either just gone on like novella at a time, right, into infinity, or in this case, you switch gears and go for what's kind of a traditional full-length work of fiction. So I'm interested in how it felt to move into that bigger scale where you're looking at a much it's a bigger, broader canvas to fill.
In some ways for me, it was trying to how shall I say, turn on certain muscles that I had turned off. Because when I first started writing, like every every very wide-eyed, eager, and have no idea what they're doing, want to be a writer person, I was like, I'm writing a novel, and I had written a gigantic, unpublishable fantasy tome, like 4 books, right? Like massive doorstopper. And so I said I
Excellent.
was an overwriter, so it's no problem for me to churn out, hundreds of pages. And I kind of turned that off when I realized, okay, I need to be serious about this. And I started looking at the short story market. And I actually, kind of forced myself to learn how to write a short story. And then I would end up writing, some of them would turn to novellas. And as you said, luckily, it was like the right place at the right time. This place opens up that says, hey, we would like to look at novellas. And you're right. I think ebooks, I think people wanting to read things that wanting to dedicate themselves to something that may not be 200, 300 pages, but that they can get through pretty easily on a commute or, on a weekend.
Mm-hmm.
I think that simply became something that made this a viable medium to sell. And so, I think in the beginning, when I started writing short stories and then moving into novellas, I knew that I was be going back to the novel world, but I was thinking, like, am I going to still be able to do that? Do I still know how? Certainly, I'm not writing the same way I was writing way back then. Those things are terrible, right? How will I hone my ability to, write a large story but not overwrite? And so it was a Master's Gin was my first return to that, and I found that some muscles had atrophied. I found that others I remembered, and I found that I had brand new muscles that I had that I could rely on to shape the story. And so, yeah, it was not as much of a challenge, an uphill challenge, as I thought it would be when I started. I mean, writing it was a challenge itself, but writing in a different form did not turn out to be like oh my goodness, I'm going to get completely lost and I won't know what I'm doing.
So, did you use your self-knowledge from the last 2 novellas to go, okay, now I'm going to write a novella and end up with a full-length novel?
in some ways. So here's what happened. After I wrote A Dead Djinn in Cairo, like I said, most of the world was in my head because I just written that. But when I realized, like, oh, people want more, I sat down, I think a year after that came out, and I made myself a timeline. And so that became like my guidebook. It was like my,
Okay.
Dungeons and Dragons, you have your monstrous manual, your fiends portfolio became my basic little Bible of, like, this is the world. And it's a full timeline. And so when I went back to write both The Haunting of Tramcar 015, when I went back to write The Haunting of Tramcar 015, that was me having this guide and now saying, okay, do something with it. And that story emerged. And you see more of the world in that story. You like see me plugging bits of the world that I'd grown. And so by the time it came around to the novel, I luckily had this guide that I could always go back to and said, when did this happen? When did this happen? Okay. I think I can create a story here.
The Black God's Drums and the Djinn stories are both alternate histories. You picked a point of divergence, and that creates a new world. Is that kind of an occupational hazard for historians? Like, do you find yourself cruising up and down the historical timeline going, what if I like twisted right here? What would happen then?
I mean, it is. And it's interesting that I love playing around with that. But on the other side, I also not to take it too seriously. Like, I love counterfactuals, but at the end of the day, I know that there's only one history, right? It's only the only history that happened is the one in which we existed as a historian, right? And so anything I tweak, anything can happen, right? As I always say, we could now be living in the global world of Paraguay, right? That's where we live right now because Paraguay has dominated the world, because anything can happen when you play with history. And so what I always, whenever I'm on in some kind of group or something and people are arguing about which counterfactual is more likely than the other, I say they're all equally it's unlikely because you've altered history. And so it's all fictional now, right? No historian is going to come in and say, well, that fiction is a bit more. No, it's all fiction now. And so I don't mind doing it because I understand that to me, I always say what is more important to me when I think of alternate history and counterfactuals is I think when you ask like what was the point of divergence and why choose that point of divergence? That's always what's more important to me. I think often the story we're often trying to tell, whether it's the man or the high castle or what have you, we're trying to tell a story based on what we changed and talking about why that was so important to our own history. Right. And
Right.
so I'm at Dead Djinn in Cairo. I'm talking about colonialism in our own world and the various problems during colonialism and the post-colonial turn. If I'm looking at the Black God's drums, I'm talking about the Civil War in our world and the history of slavery, enslavement, and of course the importance of Haiti. That's what I'm trying to do, and like everything else I do is fun. But it's not going to dislodge the history that is. And so somehow in my head I keep those two things apart. Even if as I'm going down the timeline, I'm always like, what if this had happened? What if the Prussians had done this? And anything can happen. Yeah.
Now let's talk a bit about your origin story. You moved from the U.S. to Trinidad.
I was bitten by a spider. No, it didn't happen.
Excellent. It can happen. It can happen anywhere. But live with your grandparents. Can you give me a scene or two from that childhood? How was growing up in Trinidad as a little kid?
Yeah. So I was born in the United States, but sent back. Growing up with my grandparents was I lived in a place called Chagones in Trinidad. Was living in the middle of vibrant Afro-Caribbean community, people who had been the descendants, of course, of the Middle Passage and enslaved people who had moved to Trinidad from various other islands, and also a vibrant Indian community, part of the Indian diaspora who had been brought to Trinidad as indentured servants following the end of slavery in the latter 19th century. And so I grew up in the middle of this mix, right, where I was in the middle of Hindu festivals as well as various forms of Afro-Caribbean things like carnival or what have you. I listened to various types of music. I had a great divergence of food. And so one of the things that I always had was a great mix of folklore, right? I lived in a world where it was normal to talk about the possibility of witches or sukanya type of vampires that might steal the breath of people who could take off their skin and what have you, where people would warn you about these things. I grew up watching Hindi TV, and watching the Mahabharata play out with various gods or what have you. And so I was always in this world where the fantastic always had this appeal to me. And I was always interested in it. And so, that was my early life.
And then you go right from that back to the U.S. At 8
to New
years
York.
old. And so what was that contrast like? Because that's a bit of a switch.
Yeah, it was a shock. And of course, by that time, I didn't know anything about my previous New York life. Because I was born and sent back pretty early, like after age 1. So I didn't know anything about my life in this. So it was almost like I was having the immigrant experience of this kid coming to this brand new place. I'd met my parents before, but understanding like, oh, these are my parents' parents, these are my actual parents. And I have a younger sister now. It's interesting, and just getting acculturated to all of that and getting acculturated to America and, being of all places, New York, and so it was an interesting time, but, one thing about as you're a kid, you're very malleable. And so, kids adjust. And so I just took it in stride. It's looking back at it, I think like, wow, that was a big switch. But then it was just like, okay, sure. I'm living in New York now. No big deal. And, and that sci-fi part really I think that speculative part got blown up a bit because my parents were both, my father introduced me to a ton of Godzilla movies and old Boris Karloff films. My mother loved old black and white Twilight Zones and Star Trek. And so what the base that it started in Trinidad just expanded.
You've spoken in other interviews about the sociologist and activist W.E.B. Du Bois and his notion of double consciousness, of being
Yeah,
both Black
yeah.
and American. So you layer the immigrant experience on top of that, and you get like a triple consciousness.
Yeah.
How does that, how does being able to tap into that immigrant experience change things up for you as a writer?
Yeah, I think people probably see it in my work in the way I try to bridge these various places, like the Black God's drums. One of the reasons I wanted to choose New Orleans was this perfect port place that borders the Caribbean, right? And yet it's the mainland United States, and so it's this place where, in our own history, simply for the Black diaspora, it has people coming from all over, from other parts of North America, from the Caribbean, and what have you, coming together in this one place and melding these various cultures. And I'm always fascinated by that. It's what I study, in fact, in my own in my academic sense. I look at the way there are these cross currents and movements across the Black Atlantic, movements of people or ideas and philosophies and or culture and philosophies and what have you. And so I think I always try to bring some of that where I am less interested in borders or who belongs to what nationality, because I've lived in too many places where I see them bridge. As a person whose parents come from the Caribbean and, ended up living in Texas and being steeped in Southern African American culture and folklore, and yet also having this background also of this Caribbean folklore, and finding more commonalities than trying to root out all the differences. I think that's just, you see that in a lot of my work. And so whether it's in somebody like Michael George in Ring Shout, who travels all these different places and opens up this juke joint in the middle of Macon, Georgia, or again, it's the Black God's drums. I like this movement, or even in A Master of Djinn, putting a bit of New Orleans in Cairo, right? I like this notion of movement of people.
So you have this storytelling tradition coming out of Trinidad. You've got Godzilla and Star Trek coming from the parents.
Yeah.
When did you start making your own stories?
I think early. I think nearly everybody who does some kind of creativity will probably tell you, like I'm going to tell you, it started when I was a kid. It started me wanting to write my own little stories or make little comic books. And they were mostly for my sister or my friends or what have you. But I never thought about doing anything serious. Like, oh, I could be a writer, like one of these people I read. I don't think I thought of any of that until after college. It just never clicked in my head that this is something that I would do, and I'd be looking to have my name placed in the library next to all these writers. I didn't really think about that till after college. And I mean, I can go into various reasons, social and what have you, why that is, social, personal, and why that is, but it wasn't until then. And as I told you before, when I first started, I had no idea what I was doing because my relationship to the industry was like, a million miles away. Here I was like in the wilderness. I had no idea where the industry lived. I didn't know where it hung out. I didn't know where it was. And so I was kind of in the wilderness, kind of doing my own thing. And it would take quite a while before, this is how these things are done. And here, I finally met the industry, and this is what the industry wants. Great. Let's talk. And so it took a while before I started thinking about how to do this stuff seriously.
Let's talk about the day job for a bit. And by day job, I mean the serious academic career where you're a historian and professor. Yeah. What are you working on right now?
I'm working on my manuscript, which looks at, it's called Freedom's Jubilee, and it looks at how British emancipation in the Caribbean in the 1830s has this impact on American abolitionism in the United States. And so it's my big project right now.
How long has that project been going on?
First it was a dissertation, and then it was turned into a manuscript, and now it's on its last legs. It's got to get out the door to the publisher, and so it's been a few years. It's older than Ring Shout, I'll tell you that, but not older than Black God's drums, amazingly. Yeah.
Okay, so how does that job feed this one? Are you finding bits of stories or situations and tucking them away for later, or are these two different worlds?
Sometimes I do, and I don't know that I always know that I'm doing this. When I first came across, for instance, the foundation of what would become Ring Shout of Klan as Monsters, I came across that when I was doing my master's, long before I went for a PhD. This was like 20 years ago. And I tucked it away and didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just left it there, and I didn't return to it for another 15 years. And it was when I returned to it, I suddenly, I have something to do. And so I don't think it's always like I'm never reading and mining and thinking, I could use this. It tends to be that when the story comes to me, it's probably something that I came across a long time ago. And stories, it just comes to me. So I wrote a short story called The Secret Lives of the 9 Negro Teeth of George Washington. And I'd known about that for a while, but the story didn't come to me until years later. And so all this to say, I don't know if it's so much as I'm thinking of these ideas and jotting them down saying, that'll be good. It's more so the idea coming to me and then realizing a while later, I think I know where I got this from. Something I read a year or two ago is now moving upon me to do something.
So as you've been working in fiction, as you've been writing your own book now, are there authors who you reached to or authors who you looked at who were either kind of inspiration behind the scenes or who you did kind of direct study of as you're thinking, okay, how am I going to tackle this?
Yeah, I mean, probably now she's going to get annoyed at hearing her name all the time, but N.K. Jemisin probably revolutionized how I was reading some of her works. Reading the Inheritance trilogy just blew my mind and just made me rethink.
Such a great setup.
That's a great setup. Enslaved gods? Come on. And so just made me rethink my own approach to thinking about speculative fiction and really allowing myself to imagine more. Like I felt like earlier on, believe it or not, I'd kind of confined what it was I was supposed to be thinking about speculative fiction. And I think reading some of her works really made me think about, no, it can be much more. And, other writers like Daniel Jose Older and others, reading a lot of their works and looking at how Daniel, for instance, some of his works uses, like how he uses New York and like Brooklyn, like, I know that place. I've been there, right? And so a lot of work like that, I think, has really been influential.
So as you're looking across your body of work now, do you have characters in there that you want to come back to where you feel like there's still a lot of story left in them that you haven't gotten out yet?
Oh, the great question. Maybe. So, I mean, like I always say, like, I sometimes don't, like, people are always like, what's next? And I was like, sometimes I have an idea of what's next, but for a lot of the stuff that I've recently written, I don't really have anything that's like, I know that's what I'm going to do. For one thing, for as much as I've been writing a lot of this counterfactual stuff, if you would ask me what I read, I'm a huge, fantasy reader. If you asked me what I was going to write, it was going to be some ridiculous, huge, epic fantasy tome. And so even
we're still waiting for the giant 4-volume fantasy novel. Even
doing this alternate world stuff, it's great, it's fun, and yet it still seems like, wow, who would have thought that this is what I would be writing and this is what we'd be doing so well? You wouldn't know that from the stuff I mostly read. So all this to say, I always say, like, I don't know what's coming next. I often don't. And as far as like the books that I've written, because often it takes people saying, I really like that, and then me sitting with it for a while, and then me saying, okay, I think I have an idea now. So, yeah.
Well, whatever's coming, we can't wait. Phenderson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. This was a great discussion.
I've been speaking with P. Djèlí Clark, author of the novella Ring Shout, as well as the marvelous book set in the Dead Djinn Universe. Those books and the other ones we talked about can be found at Kobo and Conversation's home on the web at kobo.com/conversation. Check the show notes for a link, and make sure to catch every conversation by subscribing wherever you listen. Kobo and Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamblyn. Thank you for listening.